Hi, this is Paul, and today's conversation is a little bit different. I think I've had you on the channel, Dan, and we've spoken about a number of things. Dan is a writer; he writes for a number of periodicals, and he's been contacted by Christian Courier, which is a periodical in Canada that is quite closely associated with the Christian Reformed Church, and they had some questions about the Quest for a Spiritual Life, spiritual home conference in Canada and Estuary. And so he contacted me and asked if we could talk and thought maybe this might be a nice thing for a video. And I said, well, I got to bring Vandonk in too, because if I would do this without John, I don't know if he'd ever forgive me. So Dan was very gracious. And John is also, John emigrated to Canada. So John has some of that Canadian cred that, I've just never lived in Canada. So here we go. So I'm going to turn this over to Dan, and Dan's going to ask the questions, and John and I are going to talk, and that's what we're doing. So
I guess to start things off, could you just talk a bit about what the Quest for a Spiritual Home Conference was?
Well, why don't you give a little bit of the back history to it, John? John and I are, we kind of tag teamed this thing together.
So it arose out of an initiative that happened a long time ago, actually, where Paul and I talked about what is happening online and the little community that is forming. And I've always been of the opinion that all of that is all good and well, but perhaps not quite as constructive as it could be unless it has some manifestation on the ground where people can meet face to face and have conversations in real life. And so this whole Estuary thing started, and I started training leaders online to spread that around, and then the thing kind of took off on its own, and some groups in Germany, people that had formed groups in Germany, decided that they wanted to have a conference, or actually they called it a festival, and bring several different estuary groups together and sort of celebrate together what they were accomplishing and what was meaningful to them. And they invited Paul and myself to come and join them as speakers there. And we talked about estuary and about church and about Christian life and about how to connect with people across ideological lines. And it was all very nice and wonderful. And then because we were in Germany, we added some other stops in Europe, in Holland and England and Ireland, and so we started to get a little feel for what could happen if you move around a little bit and create events that draw an audience, and then from that promote the idea of estuary groups in specific locations. Then Paul went to Thunder Bay, and that's somewhere in Canada, I think. And he had a lovely experience with John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pajot and himself, and a fourth person that was organized by Catherine Wilson at the Urban Abbey in Thunder Bay. And the way that experience turned out was Paul was very encouraged that seemed to be a good model for bringing local estuary groups together, and then that he kind of pictured it as an estuary hub event. And then he says, and then he says, and you're next. I said, what? I've never organized a conference in my life. It doesn't matter. Southern California, Cross Point Church is the perfect location for that. And so why don't you go ahead and do that? And I thought it was a worthy goal, and I found enough people around me to help make it happen, because I could have never done this by myself. And Crosspoint Church was very cooperative and eager to host this event, and so we made it happen as basically as a duplicate, because for a while there we were toying with the idea of calling it Thunder Bay West as a name for the conference. That didn't happen in the end, but basically what I did was I called Catherine. I says, hey, how did you do this? And then she told me, and then I said, well, I'll do the same thing. And we invited the same speakers and used the same model for the schedule. And so, yeah, that We even had paintball for Jesus as one of the features.
So this has grown out of, so Catherine and Eamon Wilson, they're both Christian psychologists in Northern Ontario, and they very much wanted to get involved. And so we were actually going to do this conference in Thunder Bay in September of 2020, but when the pandemic hit, it kept getting pushed back. And so we kept talking about what these events might look like. And yeah, then finally, when sort of the pandemic released its grip, we could start having these events. And a lot of the people, there's a real mixture of people who come to these events, some of my audience, some of John Vervaeke's audience, some of Jonathan Peugeot's audience, and there's a fair amount of overlap between these audiences as well, but also some differences. And then we'd usually bring in a fourth speaker, and in this case, we had John Vandonk, because his own personal story very much was matched the theme of the conference. We had talked about the theme of the conference with Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke, and we had a couple of ideas, but we really settled on the quest for a spiritual home. And I think that topic really helped move the conference forward and move the conversation between us forward. Myself, Jonathan Peugeot, and John Vervaeke first started talking sort of downstream of what had been happening around Jordan Peterson. John Vervaeke was a colleague of Jordan's at University of Toronto. Jonathan Peugeot was a personal friend of Jordan's, and so both of them knew him. And so, at least with the part of Jordan Peterson's exploration that involved the biblical series, A Quest for a Spiritual Home for many people, the three of us began to talk about some of the issues that were involved in terms of cognitive science, in terms of symbolism, in terms of church. And so we've continued those conversations for a number of years. And the conference sort of built on the trust that we formed with each other, and then, bringing in others to keep the conversation fresh and to keep the conversation open-ended.
And local.
Yeah. A lot of the obviously all of us sort of rose to a degree of prominence on YouTube, which is people watching us on screens or listening to podcasts. And right from the start, we've seen that we do have a generation that is starving for personal face-to-face interaction. John Vervaeke has framed this as a meaning crisis. And so one of the things that we're doing is, both with our Estuary groups in person and these gatherings together in person, is to really give people a space where they can not just see us on screens and think about us within their heads, or talk with other like-minded people on the internet, but actually come together, be in the same space. And in many of these conferences, we had camping. There was camping at Thunder Bay, but it was quite a bit rougher because the weather was colder and wetter. Camping in Chino was a big thing. So also give people a sense of community beyond just the ideas and talking to each other through screens. And so obviously an in-person event affords that.
Can you talk a bit about who the people are that came to the conference?
Well, actually, that was the beauty of it all. We did zero advertising. So basically what that meant was we informed the respective audiences of Paul, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Peugeot. We informed them that this thing was about to happen. And I gave the leaders of the Estuary Leader Support Network advance notice. I really wanted a good representation of them to be there, so I invited them. And between all of that, that was the only advertising we did. We never put it in any newspaper or on social media. We just each person informed their own audience, their own subscriber list, that this thing was happening, and that was enough to draw just a perfect size crowd.
The audiences of our respective communities, there is some commonality between them, and a lot of it is sort of, again, downstream from Jordan Peterson. When I first started making my commentary videos on Jordan Peterson's biblical series, I had a lot of young men. Now, young, usually above college age. The sort of the normal demographic is kind of between 25 and 45 of this audience, and it's mostly male. Many of these young men, for a time, were enamored with the new atheists. Many of them had sort of deconstructed and wandered away from the church or wandered away from Christianity. Others had never had any involvement in Christianity, but in a lot of ways were suffering from, as John Vervaeke calls it, a meaning crisis, often sort of a nihilism-induced depression. And what happened, Jordan Peterson sort of energized their agency and said, you know, you have to go out, you have to do something, you have to take responsibility. And then with the biblical series, he basically suggested to them that there might be something in the Bible that's worth looking for. And out of this, a certain number of young men began exploring orthodoxy. Some began to explore Catholicism. Others would return to, let's say, the Christian roots that they perhaps might have had. And a lot of this was happening via the internet. And that's where people were coming to me. I would have conversations with them, and then sort of a little community of people that I had had conversations with, along with others. We had started a Discord server that had collected some people. Some other people started other YouTube channels. And so then we had sort of more celebrities in there, Grim Grizz, Chad the Alcoholic, Karen Wong. It tended to be younger men and older women. Another, I'd say the second demographic of this tended to be mothers who were often concerned with their sons, or older women that had noticed that young men have sort of lost their way, and this was troubling for them. And so these tended to be the people that would gather. And again, for the most part, that tends to be most of the people at the conference. There are always some other Christians who immediately see the evangelistic potential of this and are attracted to it. Other people who are very interested in spirituality and attracted by the openness of our conversations. The fact that, you know, at least myself, I'm a Reformed minister. Jonathan Pajot is an Orthodox icon carver and someone who makes videos about symbolism. And John Vervaeke is a non-theist cognitive scientist who is exploring, you know, what happens now sort of after modernity, and taking all the new learning of cognitive science and trying to bring that into what he calls an ecology of practices in order to address the meaning crisis. So it's a very open group. And what makes it very unusual is that you would have both people who are highly committed to conservative Christianity, like Orthodoxy or Catholicism, or various Protestant groups, people who are very open to sort of new age stuff. They seem to be welcome in the group. And also people who are, you know, maybe have deconstructed from Christianity, but still curious about it. People who maybe don't have any religious inclinations, but tend to be attracted to these meaningful discussions and are impressed by the fact that, unlike a lot of the conversations out there in the broader public, there aren't these political landmines that you step on and sort of have these gotcha moments. So it's become also sort of an open forum where people can ask difficult questions and explore the kinds of things they're thinking about.
And also, this one small portion of the audience would be people who are very attracted to those kinds of conversations, and they are faithful members of their local churches, and find that the local church is not particularly welcoming of some of the harder questions that these guys or gals are looking for answers for, and are wanting to put on the table for conversation. And so it's almost like a little escape route for the church to just send people who ask difficult questions off to the estuary.
So I think that helps also explain a little bit about Estuary. When I began making videos about Jordan Peterson's biblical series, I was unprepared for what would come at me from the internet. I had no idea what YouTube really was. And suddenly I'm getting email after email from people who they're telling me their story. they just want to talk to me. So I'm having conversations on Zoom with people, and I'm noting that, well, there's a fair amount of patterns and repetitions that are developing. And so I start recording some of them with permission, and I start sharing some of them with permission. And that only accelerated the impact. As a pastor of a small church, I had always wanted more and better conversations with people outside of my church, but found it quite difficult to have sort of a space that afforded that. And then I began noticing that the conversations, the people now coming to me through the internet, very much were eager and hungry for those kinds of conversations. So I started a Jordan Peterson meetup group here in my church. I had met John on an online forum called CRC Voices. He was watching what was going on around me, and he got interested in Jordan Peterson meetup groups. We ran Jordan Peterson meetup groups for a while. We were helping other Jordan Peterson meetup groups start in different places in the West and in California, both because Jordan Peterson had basically, he disappeared from public life because of illness for a while, and because after a while, the Jordan Peterson stuff in and of itself sort of got stale. We tended to have a lot of people who would come in and they want to talk about culture war stuff, and you could talk about culture war stuff, but if that's all you're talking about, that got stale. And so we knew that we wanted to transition into something that was even broader than just a Jordan Peterson interest group, and something that would allow the group itself to sort of source the conversations and the topics of conversations that we would have, and that would keep it a lot fresher. And John really developed what I called the Estuary protocol, which was sort of a way by which the group itself could decide what to talk about and regulate the conversation. I came up with the term estuary because I had always wanted something church adjacent, because as a minister, I saw church people would shy away from asking honest questions that they suspected others in the church might think were theologically wrong, or they might say make them sound stupid, or perhaps heretical. And so that sort of retards a lot of honest conversation in church. And I thought, if we could have a space church adjacent where we could talk about these things, and maybe people in church could go there to talk about difficult things that might not be welcome at a Bible study, and people outside the church could come in and see that, church people aren't just a bunch of automatons, mimicking what their pastors or theological traditions say. They actually are thinking, breathing human beings who have all of the same questions that all of us have out there in the world beyond the church. So couldn't Estuary be sort of a place where this fresh water from the mountain and salt water from the Great Sea mix, and couldn't we meet there and have some really interesting and productive conversations? And so that was the vision for Estuary.
What did each of you think about when you were preparing your talks for the conference?
Well, we had done so based on some of the first conferences, I very much wanted to set up this conference in sort of also kind of an estuary space between online and in real life. And so one of the things that we did was we had a warm-up conversation where myself, Jonathan Peugeot, John Vervaeke, John Vandonk, and Catherine Wilson all got together online to sort of jumpstart the conversation. We had talked at Thunder Bay, and then that conference was about consciousness and conscience. And I wanted to sort of get things going, and John came with ideas, Jonathan came with ideas, I had ideas, and so online we could begin the conversation. And so from that, seeing sort of what these other guys were working on, and then we determined sort of the order of speaking at the conference. And so, for my talk, I very much wanted something that would sort of set up the conference and introduce the topic, and then it sort of developed from there. And I wanted John Vandonk to tell his story, because his life story has very much been the quest for a spiritual home.
That initial conversation, by the way, was posted on Paul's channel around April 11 of this year. Yeah, so you can find that. So I basically was told what to say, and I just said it. No, I'm somewhat cognizant of the fact that a person's journey can take some strange twists and turns. I am a trained CRC pastor. I was a pastor for almost 10 years and then ceased to be a pastor. I was a happily married person, father of 3 daughters until I was no more married. And so that was a major turning point in my life. I have some memories of my own childhood where a father was missing. So there was some trauma associated with that. And so all these different themes kind of coalesced into a story that I was able to kind of weave together. And my goal was to definitely disavow the notion that the quest for a spiritual journey is linear, so that it's a never-ending path to progress, that it can be fraught with all kinds of pitfalls and crises and different things that somehow only start to make sense in retrospect. I was the oldest guy there, so I have a little bit of retrospecting to do. And so I tried to paint that picture that looking back, certain things that didn't make sense at the time began to take on somewhat of a meaning. And that's not a very encouraging message to people that are just in the throes of it all right now and that want some answers right now. But I was being honest about that. I says, it's not going to all fall in place per your command. And no matter how intentional you are about all this, there are still some things that can happen that kind of throw a monkey wrench in the whole journey, and you need to kind of adapt yourself to that. But then I also was able to say, hey, there are resources available around from different sources and in different forms. And I particularly wanted to draw attention to the fact that we are in a building that is owned by a community of people who caught me on the downside when I was in kind of broken and in pieces. This group of people was able to come around me and love me and give me a sense of belonging, and so I was able to paint a picture of this particular church, which, even though I don't necessarily agree with everything that they teach or stand for, or maybe sometimes I'm a little bit of a gadfly or an oddball in this community, nevertheless, they were the people that provided an anchor for me on the journey since then. And so I wanted to paint that picture also. And I think that when everything was said and done, I managed to stay within my time limit. And so it was all good.
I have a question just for you, John. You talked about your breakfast group that you had. Was that kind of the origin point of your thoughts around Estuary?
Well, yeah, I sometimes say that I'm a one-trick pony. Yes, that actually is true. That arose out of the Promise Keepers movement, and so way back when Promise Keepers was the in thing that was going to save the church and society and the whole world, pretty much. I went to that conference and I came back and I said, these are marching orders, and I think that for the most part, people have a pretty good idea what they're called upon, what their obligations are, what they're called upon to do. The real question is what happens when you fail, and what space is there for people who trying hard though they might fail and find themselves with a sense of failure themselves, with a lost reputation in the eyes of others. What happens when you are walking around with some secrets that you don't really want the whole world to know about, but nevertheless, you need to find a place where you can have an honest conversation about some of those things and still have a sense of acceptance and attachment and belonging. And I found that in what I ended up doing was, back in the day of the Promise Keepers, I gathered a group of guys around and basically asked them that same question. I mean, was the Promise Keeper Challenge something that is going to totally inspire your life? And I don't know if I was asking leading questions or what, but I got the impression that every one of them said, no, we know perfectly well what we're supposed to do. It's what happens when we fail to do it. That's when things get a little crazy. And so that became the model of pretty much anything and everything I've done since then. Whether it be organizing small groups. I was part of Mariners here in Southern California when they had their when John Townsend and Henry Cloud were doing Monday night solution seminars, and on Wednesday night they had their small group Wednesday night application. I was the small group trainer, the leader for the. I was training the leaders for those small groups on how to be, how to be better listeners, how to create a tone of safety in the group and make sure that confidentiality is upheld, and then model that behavior for other people to see, so that it's not just me telling you how to do it, but model it for other people to experience that. And that's kind of what the foundation was for my understanding of small group dynamics. And it wasn't that hard for me to adapt the Peterson meetup groups to that same model, and that's kind of how it has been ever since.
Is it mostly men that attend the estuaries?
Not mine. I have several women in my own local estuary, and I think 20% of the people at the conference were women also, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, my estuary has more and more women as well. It's partly because the Jordan Peterson following was so male. But the women who have grabbed onto this have grabbed on pretty hard.
Okay. Were there any particular interactions you had with attendees of the conference that stood out, like as particularly meaningful?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sorry. Were there any interactions you had with attendees at the conference which were particularly meaningful interactions?
For me, a big part of it is getting to meet some of the people that I only see online, and getting a sense of them in a deeper way. There were two brothers and a brother-in-law who came. Ken Lowry and his brother-in-law Ken has a YouTube channel called Climbing Mount Sophia. And I gave these guys rides back and forth between the hotel and the church most of the time. And it was really powerful seeing brothers just working out family questions and family stuff together in this area. I came to this conference to create and strengthen friendships. Grim Grizz is someone who's been around the channel for a while. I was really looking forward to meeting Grizz. Chad the Alcoholic, he had been to another conference too, but to get to sort of deepen that. Father Eric, he's a Catholic priest from Fargo, North Dakota. He had come to Thunder Bay as well, but I got a chance to do dinner with him this time. And then also for me too, even though I've had a number of online conversations with Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke, some of the in real life time that we can spend together, and that's both on stage and off stage, is really important. One of the things, it's in the time before the internet, we didn't realize some of the riches that we had. So much of our capacity to have productive and meaningful communication and relationship is all dependent upon trust. And it being together in real life is essential for building a significant level of trust. There's a lot that's sort of intangible about that. And we never would have recognized it until we sort of had screens to recognize the lack of it in some ways. And so, again, a lot of this is meeting in real life. And then also just a number of people that Most people don't leave comments. Most people don't write me emails. Most people don't talk to me on Twitter, but I always go to a conference and there'll be a whole group of people that they get a chance to meet me. I might meet them over lunch or something. We have lunch in these common spaces, and I've been watching your stuff, and this is a little bit of my story, and this has been helpful for me. That then gives me a much more tangible sense of the mission, where most of the time I'm in my office by myself talking to this silly camera.
So 3 things. One is just a tie-in with what Paul just said. When we were in England, we went to one Estuary meeting where a particular person who was somewhat annoying and perhaps even a little bit mean and definitely a troublemaker in the comment section online showed up for a real event in Manchester. And he announced ahead of time that he was going to cause trouble and he was going to set us all straight. And it turned out that once the Estuary protocol was implemented and everybody fell in line, he fit right in and he did a beautiful job. And it was the most satisfying experience to see how he just, I don't keep track of him now anymore. Paul, you probably know more about that than I do, but at that particular time, in person, in the presence of other people, I think it was a good experience for him, and it was certainly a good experience for all of us. The other thing that, to your question, the thing that was for me was that I always had a bit of a vision for implementing or using Estuary as a way to give the attendees of the conference an experience beyond just listening to lectures, but to have a platform or a space within which to process what they were hearing and to also experience the Estuary protocol as a meaningful tool to promote meaningful conversation. And so to that end, I had invited, I have about 100 people participating in ELSNet, have participated off and on, and I send an invitation to all of them to join the conference, and 20 of them did. And so I think in the end only 18 showed up, but even from England, people came from far away, and they are trained in running these estuary groups. And so I asked them to actually run estuary groups at the conference, even to the point that before anyone set a foot in the auditorium, they had already been herded into estuary groups of 10 people each in their own separate room. Crosspoint Church has a pretty large facility with room for all these things to be taking place in different spaces. And so then the feedback I got was that these estuary leaders did such a great job of helping these people, many of whom didn't know each other from Adam and had never met before, find a friendly face. They walked in as strangers and they walked out with 9 friends, and so they walked into the conference with 9 friends, and that was kind of a powerful thing. And then for these people to give the credit for that to the estuary leaders who knew how to navigate that whole scene, I was really proud of those guys, and that was a very meaningful thing for me. I already forgot what the third thing was.
That's okay. You kind of talked about this with screens and stuff, but is there anything else either you would say about why estuary is needed at the present moment in time?
Well, I think that now I'm talking long view. In the West, we have sort of had the impression that churches were spaces where you had to be very careful about what you said, because you were going to step on theological landmines. You would get in trouble. You might come under some kind of church discipline. If you're clergy, you might be under some kind of censure, and you have to be very careful about what you say in church. and the public space and the universities, they were the place for free thinking and exploration and openness. I think we have seen an inversion in our culture. Now, people can say what they want to say in church to a degree, depending on which church, so on and so forth. That really hasn't gone away. But church people understand these kinds of dynamics and cancel culture, and church people understand that and have sort of adjusted to it. Out there in the broader culture now, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety about the fact that there is a layer of political correctness that looks absolutely theological, and this has gripped the academy and the political realm. And there's so much polarization that, ironically, the church is a place that people can go to speak freely on a whole range of topics. And so I think this is, and also, so there's, when we were in London, they have like Speaker's Corner, a place that very famously you can go to and spout off whatever you want to spout off. It's sort of a free speech center. Ironically, when we started Estuary and the meetup groups, John was a little bit leery about, would people come to church to do this, or might they sort of be spooked by the fact that this is a church? And when I started my groups, I used the church just basically because I was the pastor. It was available. It was a space that I could use for free. We had chairs, and church is just basically set up to bring in strangers and have a conversation. That was easy. And so then,
in his church,
in my church. And so then I began to, and most of the people who would come to my meetings are atheists. And so then I would ask the atheist, I would say, now we're having this in church. Does this make you feel nervous or anything? And it was actually the atheist that began to say, well, no, I think actually it's better in church because better than like a bar or a restaurant, because maybe in church people will behave a little better and be a little bit more serious about the conversation. That completely took me by surprise. But again, I think part of the reason that people are looking to the church actually as a place where they can speak honestly and share vulnerably is because the assumption is that you could do that in university or you could do that in the public realm. And increasingly we see in these realms, there's so much conflict and polarization that the church might actually be a haven.
Well, I'm going to slightly differ with Paul on this point, because I do believe that there is still a good many churches that would have a difficult time hosting an estuary, and that actually is borne out by the number of ELSNet leaders that would like to start an estuary and that go talk to their church leaders and find no traction and considerable pushback. If it's not going to bring people to Jesus, then we don't really want to deal with it. So estuary is, per definition, not that. It is mutually respectful conversation across ideological lines. So it does not have any evangelistic explicit purpose, although a person may well discover something that attracts them to Jesus while they're there. So that makes it all the more unique and interesting when there are churches who are, in fact, able and willing to see that through. And that's actually a little bit part of the story of Crosspoint and me at Crosspoint, because this has been a kind of a project of mine in different iterations and formats as long as I've been there, in the 30 years that I've been there, and only recently has the church said, yeah, we need to have that role. And then pretty much the way Paul says, there are so many other spaces where that's no longer possible, so maybe we can fill that void and do that. And so now at my church, the doors are open and people say, yeah, we want to sponsor these kind of conferences. We want you to have a space for your own estuary meeting, and they are welcoming people onto the premises. And I also thought of the third thing I was going to say earlier, because we also served dinner at Crosspoint Church during the conference. we were able to serve dinner for 200 people. We all room full of people. And now I must admit that sometimes that was for funerals, and then it's usually a little bit quiet. Sometimes it was for church events, then it's not quite so quiet. I've been there for weddings and not terribly quiet, but the buzz in the room when we were meeting for dinner, the enthusiasm and the passion with which people wanted to engage with one another around the tables, it was just a delight. It was wonderful to be in their presence. So, but back to the question of the place of the church in this larger phenomenon. I think that Paul is right in that more and more churches will recognize this as a need in the world and perhaps be more accommodating. As it is right now, there are still plenty of churches that really are not really all that eager to welcome activity outside of their confessional boundaries. And in some ways you can say, well, that is in some ways they're to be commended for clarity of vision for the purpose for which they exist. On the other hand, and that's why I think there is a unique meaning to Paul's use of the word church adjacent. No, we're not doing this in the churches. We're doing this church adjacent. We're doing this. We may use the building. The church may sponsor this activity as something that they believe is a valuable thing, much like a church might sponsor a food bank or another ministry to the homeless or some other kind of outreach of different kinds that does not necessarily require confessional compliance. Estuary is kind of like that. It is a place where people can come to have a conversation about anything. And so I think that the less it happens in the academia and the political world, I think Paul is right, the more it will happen more it will need to happen elsewhere. And so if churches can step up to that plate and rise to that challenge, I think it'd be a great thing.
Could you what do you think people are seeking in Estuary?
So we had this conference, and people were, to one degree or another, drawn by the speakers at a small conference like this. And we like to hold smaller conferences. We haven't held any really large events. This was the largest event that we've held so far. This was 200 people, which still is sort of right there at that Dunbar number. Of course, people want to come and they want to meet Jonathan Peugeot or John Vervaeke. And we had talks on stage, and then we don't just have individual talks on stage. We arrange the conference so that we talk with each other. John Vervaeke has this idea about dialogos, which is sort of a following the logos in dialogue. I can call it that way. But during the conference, I would often ask people, okay, how's this going? What are you enjoying? Just to see what comes to the top. And even though people enjoyed the speeches, and I posted the speeches online so that people can watch them on YouTube, and people have enjoyed them, even though people liked the speakers and the speeches, the number one thing I heard from about everyone is they loved the interaction with other people. Again and again, people would say to me, we were able to get right past the small talk stage and have meaningful conversations with each other, with people I didn't know at all. I just came to the conference, I sat down next to someone, and bang, I was talking to this person like I could trust this person, and this person was a longtime friend, and I could share things about my life, and they shared things about their lives. And that was the number one piece of feedback I got from the people about what they valued in this conference. It wasn't, okay, they got to meet Jonathan Peugeot or John Vervaeke, or they got to hear John and Jonathan talk. It was, I got there and immediately I found people that I could have a meaningful conversation with, that I left feeling there's something in that conversation. In John Vervaeke terms, they experienced dialogos, not just in terms of watching it on stage between to people on stage, but right there among the meals, in the estuary groups, around the campfire camping, or in the hot tub at the hotel. And that was the key thing for people.
So that is not to take away from the fact that the speakers clearly modeled trust. The speakers, in the way that they engage with one another in the Dialogos sessions, they modeled the kind of mutual respect and listening skills and trust that we also are looking for in the small groups. So I just wanted to highlight that. But the other thing that happened was, way before the conference even started, we had a pre-conference paintball contest. It's called Paintball for Jesus, and I hope it'll be a tradition for future conferences. And there was a bit of a delay on the part of the organizers of the paintball court. So you would think that there's a lot of, we got there in a bus and everybody's sitting around. It's a little bit, it was one of the hottest days of the whole conference. And we're all kind of sitting around tables, waiting. You would think that people were getting a little restless and a little annoyed, perhaps. Not in the least. There were incredible conversations happening right there, 15 minutes after they all got together and a day before the conference had even started. So this was an amazing thing.
And I think, so let's say if you had, let's say, a Promise Keepers conference or a church group conference. I mean, John and I have been part of plenty of those kinds of things where you already have a fair amount of commonality between the people. They're all got the same religious tradition. They might even be, like in the Christian Reformed Church, they might even be cousins to each other. And so, but what I think really surprised people here was, of course, the variety of people that were there. There was no theological commonality between people. So I was having a conversation with one guy on the bus out there, and he was talking about this dynamic, and he said, wouldn't it be something if, like, everyone in this bus was in the same church? And I said, the irony of this is that couldn't be, because at the last conference they actually held communion in the service. And when the pastor of that church announced that, I thought, oh no, because the Orthodox aren't going to have communion here. The Catholics aren't going to have communion here. The non-Christians aren't going to have communion here. This is just kind of communion for the Protestants because they're kind of the most flexible. And so what I think gives the energy to the interaction here is the fact that there's both a huge amount of diversity between the people, and they very quickly feel like they have a commonality. And I think in our multi-everything world, where now via the internet, even just within the Christian traditions, there's incredible diversity that they could very quickly begin to have productive conversations that wouldn't just be squabbling between Protestants and Catholics, or Orthodox, or Christians versus atheists, or Jews, or New Agers, or whatnot. That despite all of those things, they very quickly could find something in common, and not just avoid these meaningful theological worldview things, but actually engage them productively. Now, they'd leave and they'd wind up going back to their Orthodox churches, their Catholic churches, or their non-churches. But while they were there, they sensed something that I can talk to these people about what's most meaningful to me and even compare notes, and it's safe, healthy, and fulfilling.
Yeah, I also wanted to say something about that video that you sent me, Paul. I can't think of the guys' names anymore, but they're all, I think they're all non-Christians. 3 guys that had a conversation.
They're actually all Christians. Some of them are even Christian Reformed.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Now that makes that conversation, that makes that conversation even more incredible, because they were talking about what it was like for them to walk into that church.
Yeah.
Are we talking about the same 3 guys?
The video I just sent you yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah, 3 young guys. Yeah.
Because they made a comment about how weird it was to walk into this church thing for this philosophical conference.
Yeah, one of them, he got to the conference, and he mentioned his father, and I knew his father because his father used to be in Northern California. He's an RCA pastor, and I worked with him on a project. And the other guys were Christian Reformed.
Really?
Yes.
Well, I had them pegged wrong. Wow.
Yeah, and what's amazing, and that again is telling, because I think part of it is the internet. People have an openness because of the internet that they'll talk about things that they're not going to talk about that stuff in church like that. They wouldn't dare.
It was fascinating.
But yet it's in their heart. And if you have to segment your heart, I mean, as a pastor, I know you want people in church with their whole heart. But if they're sort of, for whatever reasons, they're in church, they're going through the motions, they believe it, it's not, they haven't left, but they have all of these questions in their heart, and they've heard a lot of the pat answers, and maybe that has helped somewhat, but it hasn't dispelled the questions. Where do you go to process this? Now, maybe you can do it one-on-one with the pastor, but it's really hard to do it with the other people in the church. And so people are going outside the church to do this. And a lot of those people who go outside the church to do this eventually just leave the church. So what if we had a place church adjacent where you could actually talk about what you were really thinking or doubting or exploring, and actually have some people from the church who weren't going to be there to say, wrap your knuckles with a ruler, but to say, okay, well, let's think about that. Let's talk about that. And so to not make it so I have to leave the church in order to ask these questions. No, why don't you stay here and in this little space next to the church, and let's explore them together. And maybe you'll find that these older people in the church that you don't really know, they've had their own questions over the years, and they might continue to have questions and still be in the church and still be faithful, loyal members of the church who still uphold the beliefs of the church, but they've actually worked through some of these things. And if you're in relationship with them, you might find something worth keeping from them.
I have a lovely mix in my own estuary between Jews, one Muslim guy, former Jehovah's Witness, and a couple of atheists, and 1.5 Christians, and we are able to have incredible conversations where those denominational or religious differences are not particularly relevant or salient. Even they don't actually come to the fore immediately. They show up in subtle ways along the way, but that's not the thing that we lead with. And I've also thought about it from a pastoral point of view. So now a pastor notices that a person is sort of withdrawing a little bit from the community of faith. And some weird conversations and some weird things he hears through the grapevine, and before you know it, the guy's gone, or the gal. They just disappear, and the pastor is the last one to find out about it. Whereas if this thing could exist adjacent to the church, it could be like a way to keep a person connected to the community while exploring the truth of the doctrines in a more or less neutral fashion, and do that in the same way where other people who are kind of new to the faith and are kind of exploring things from a completely outsider perspective, to do that in the same space, and to have that kind of interplay between newly inquiring people and almost nuns that are on their way out, and to have that space where they can intermix a little bit. I think that's kind of a cool thing.
So if people want to set up an estuary where they live, what should they do? How could they get in contact with you, or what would you recommend?
I send them to John, because John,
Yeah.
so John's a number of times, John's really bad at this, because he kept ElseNet. I'm waiting for John to tell the people what ElseNet is, John, because nobody knows what an ElseNet is. That's a word you made up. So tell them about ElseNet, John.
I already used the whole line. I didn't say ElseNet here in this thing.
You said ElseNet a number of times in this
I also
thing.
said Estuary Leader Support Network. You just don't hear that stuff. You gotta take those earphones off. No, the Estuary Leader Support Network. And what we did was we created a website. Basically, it is designed. And right after this meeting, I have another meeting in which we're going to kind of refine the vision a little bit about what the Estuary Hub website is designed to do and what it is capable of doing. So what it is designed to do is people can sign up there. If they are aspiring leaders, they can sign up for that and receive the twice monthly reminder with link for the Zoom sessions that happen 6 times a month. I have different groups that meet at different times, and people participate in those conversations where we basically practice the Estuary protocol to make people thoroughly familiar with that, and they can do it with their eyes closed and in their sleep while leading a meeting so that they can concentrate on other things that are more important. So to meet, what refreshments to serve, whether to put the chairs in a circle or in a row, or whatever. The little mechanical things about how to set it up, and how do you talk to your pastor or the elders and ask them if he can use the space? How do you explain what it is and all of that? So that is for the leaders. But Estuary Hub is also designed to help people who are interested in participating in an estuary group to find out if there are groups and or leaders near where they live. So it's intended to be a geographical finding machine where you can discover whether there are other people near you who are interested in being part of a group. I had a really funny thing happen to me yesterday. I had a guy contact me from Adelaide. Actually, he contacted me from Minneapolis. He has a friend in Adelaide, Australia, and would I know of any other people that are interested in an estuary in Adelaide, Australia? I've never been to Adelaide, Australia. I noticed that it's eight hours away from Melbourne, Australia, where I happen to have one leader several leaders actually are from Melbourne. They run estuary groups in Melbourne. And so I wrote one of them. I says, hey, do you know anybody in Adelaide that might be interested in starting an estuary group with this guy? Oh, yeah, I'll get back to you tomorrow about that.
Perfect.
So it is a network where we try and encourage people to get things going on the ground. It's still in the throes of infancy. And so we, I mean, if every time you go look for a group, the nearest group is 5 hours away, that's a little bit discouraging. But that is kind of where we're at. I mean, we're spread out all over the world, and they're not in the kind of density that you would like to have so that anybody can find a place, within a half an hour of where they live. But that is, maybe the vision down the road. I don't know if we can facilitate that by way of the website, but I'm going to continue to welcome aspiring leaders into my network, and hopefully train a few of them to run this network themselves, because I'm really, really old. And so I got to quit this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. Thank you to both of you for spending time with me today.
Well, thank you, Dan. Thanks for your interest, and
appreciate it.
Wait to, if you need any other things for the article, let us know.
For sure.
Yeah, put estuaryhub.com in the show notes.
I will.
Is it .com or .org?
Com.
Okay. Just want to make sure.
Sounds good. I'll put it in the show notes. Okay, thank you again.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Dan.